You're listening to the Bold Apologia podcast. Here you can expect to find real conversation and dialogue centralized around the purpose for sharing the hope of Jesus Christ in light of theology, apologetics, and culture. We hope and believe this episode will add confidence to your faith by equipping you with boldness to share the good news of the gospel. And now, your host, Adam Parker.
Well, hello there, Bold Apologia podcast listeners. My name is Adam. I am the host of this podcast, and if you have been following the podcast for some time, I just want to say thank you for tuning in to Season 3. I am so excited to jump into a new year of doing the Bold Apologia podcast, and I just love going through some of the topics that I've been able to go through with you guys. This is a podcast where we delve into the depths of Christian apologetics. There's also theology that we jump into, cultural issues, things like that. And we go through and defend the truths of the gospel and just cover an array of topics that are valuable to be taken a look at. And so I'm excited about what I'm going to be talking about in this podcast. And I just think that there's so much good coming down the pike. What I'm really excited about is soon I'm going to be moving into more of a video podcast. So there will be a YouTube channel coming sometime this year, as well as just some new features that I get to use for the podcast. And there's some other exciting things that I'm looking into. So I'm just really excited about the opportunities ahead. I have somewhat of a new setup for the podcast, and things are just really looking like they're going in an exciting direction. So, with that said, this podcast is going to be a little interesting. I think it's a good subject to cover, and it's the subject of the Shroud of Turin. And so in this podcast, we're going to be exploring what has been considered to be one of the most enigmatic and debated artifacts in Christian history. And so this is a linen cloth. It bears a faint image of a man who appears to have suffered crucifixion, which has led many to believe that it is the actual burial shroud of Jesus Christ. And there's debates about its authenticity, but I've come to believe that there's some serious reasons to believe that this burial shroud is quite authentic, especially when it comes to the mystery surrounding how this burial shroud was actually formed. So I find that very interesting. I'm looking forward to jumping in more. Now, there's some things to talk about when it comes to this. I know that I'm going to get some flack from some people, particularly my fellow Protestant brothers and sisters in Christ. And the reason for this is they would be like, come on, Adam, that is a Catholic relic. And we don't need Catholicism's help in order to believe in the historicity of the resurrection. And I just want to say right off the bat, I agree. We don't need the Shroud of Turin in order to believe in the resurrection. In fact, if we took away the Shroud of Turin, I would still believe that Jesus rose from the dead on the basis of the overwhelming evidence that we have for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I think that needs to be made very clear. I don't want anyone to misunderstand me when it comes to that. However, there's no doubt that the Shroud of Turin and the authenticity of it could be used to point to a more cumulative case for the truth that the resurrection took place. Now, there's some interesting things about this. There's a scientific analysis that points to its ancient origins. There's this profound theological implications that it holds as a result. And so why not take a deeper look into the Shroud of Turin? I think that's something that should be considered, at least. And so by no means is this the Shroud of Turin is authentic, therefore the resurrection is authentic, but it really serves as just one more piece to the puzzle of really developing this cumulative case for the resurrection and the historicity of the Gospels in general. It's quite an interesting artifact, if you ask me. So what is the Shroud of Turin? Now, it should be stated, the Shroud of Turin has actually some very interesting historical continuity. I want to begin by tracing the historical journey of the Shroud of Turin. The earliest undisputed records place the Shroud of Turin in the small town of Loret, France, around 1353 to 1357, where it was in possession of a guy named, and I've got to say, I'm not French, but I'm going to give my best French accent. It's Geoffroy du Charny. And so this guy, he was interesting because he was a knight. And he was a prominent French knight who had a highly decorated military career under two kings, one of those being King Philip VI, and then there was King John II. And he served under these kings during the 100 Years' War, which took place between 1337 and 1453 between France and England over various territorial claims and political disputes. Now, with that said, Geoffroy was more than just a man of the sword. He was also an author and thinker on chivalry. He's especially known for his treatise, The Book of Chivalry, which provides a detailed account of the ideals and ethics and practices of knighthood. And so the exact way that Geoffroy obtained the Shroud of Turin is really unknown. We don't know for certain, as no historical documents really have been able to explain how it came into his possession. However, theories suggest that he may have acquired the relic from the Byzantine Empire, possibly through trade, warfare, or even as an inheritance, as relics were highly valued by European nobility in the Middle Ages. He first displayed the shroud publicly around 1355 at a church he founded in the small town of Loret, France, which is where we can trace this thing back to. This period marks the beginning of the well-documented history of the shroud. However, intriguing evidence suggests that the shroud's history kind of extends further back than that. Some researchers propose that the shroud may be linked to a legendary relic known as the Image of Edessa, which is also known as the Mandilion, which is a cloth bearing the image of Jesus's face, and it was venerated in the city of Edessa, located in modern-day Turkey. So this is a legendary relic, and it is apparently from as far back as the 6th century. According to tradition, the image of Edessa was sent by Jesus Christ himself to King Abgar V of Edessa, and apparently Abgar was sick with a severe illness, and so he wrote Jesus asking for a cure. And so as a result of this, apparently Jesus healed King Abgar by sending back a towel that had the imprint of his face on it. And so as a result, Abgar converted to Christianity, and the Mandilion remained in Edessa until 944 AD, where historical accounts report that this relic was transferred to Constantinople at that time. And as a result, some scholars, they actually theorize that the legend of the Mandilion actually finds a connection with the Shroud of Turin, which, as we'll discuss a little later, has some overlapping similarities to this, considering it has the face of Jesus on it. So scholars think that perhaps the story of the Mandilion was a fabricated legend, and that instead they found the Shroud of Turin rather than a newly printed cloth. So there's all that, but there's more. It should also be noted here that during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, numerous relics were looted from Constantinople, and some historians suggest that the Shroud was among them, eventually resurfacing in France in the 14th century with our friend Geoffroy, that French knight. And while these connections are subject to debate and rely on really circumstantial evidence, they do provide a plausible narrative that extends the Shroud's history well before its medieval appearance in France from the 6th century in Edessa to Constantinople and then to Lorraine. Because of time constraints, I'll just list off the rest of the timeline here. In 1355, it was displayed in Lorraine, France. Then it was transferred to an influential noble family known as the House of Savoy, who safeguarded it for centuries, moving it to and fro from various locations to protect it. In 1532, the Shroud survived a devastating fire in the chapel of Chambray, France, which left some scorch marks and water stains on the cloth, which nuns repaired by sewing some patches onto the Shroud, which remained visible to this day. In 1578, the Shroud was actually transferred to Turin, Italy, which is what it's named after. It is currently located in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist even to this day, and it has been under the control of the Vatican since 1983, when King Umberto II, the last ruler of the House of Savoy, bequeathed the Shroud to the Vatican. It now remains under the custody of the Archbishop of Turin. Now, the history surrounding this is interesting, but the facts surrounding the Shroud of Turin are even more impressive and could highlight the legitimacy of the Shroud as well as the resurrection. Now, again, this is highlighting the legitimacy of the resurrection. I am not basing my belief in the resurrection solely on this Shroud. Okay? So, first, I want to talk about the mysterious image formation that took place on the Shroud. It's quite interesting how this took place. And really, it's one of the most compelling aspects of the Shroud of Turin because of the nature of the image imprinted on it. Scientific examinations have revealed that the image is not the result of pigments, dyes, or any form of applied artistry. Instead, the discoloration that forms the image is confined to the outermost fibers of the linen. So the linen of this Shroud. And it's with no penetration into the deeper layers. And so this suggests that the image was formed through a process that didn't involve the application of any known substances. And so what does that mean? That simply means we have no clue how this got there. Now, there's some theories, but we just have no clue how it happened, considering the lack of technology that they had in the time that this particular artifact would have been put together. And so, how did we determine that this was really a mystery? Well, in 1898, there was an Italian photographer by the name of Secondo Pia who took the first ever photographs of the Shroud. And at the time, photography required the use of glass plates, which were coated with a light-sensitive emulsion to capture an image. When developed, it would be developed in a dark room, and these plates would produce a photographic negative, which is an inverted version of the original image. I don't know if you guys pay attention to memes at all, but there was a trend a couple years ago where this very thing was done. People would invert an image. For example, let's say if it was Gandalf in the "You shall not pass" meme, and people would invert that image, and it was supposed to resemble Gandalf's dark side, and that they would meme accordingly. It would be just kind of a dark humor trend that was taking place. And so that's kind of what Secondo kind of ran into here, is there was an inverted image of this particular, how do I want to explain it, imprint of this person that was on the cloth. And so, yes, this was an inverted version of the original image. And if you want a more understandable example, I guess, you could consider that in a negative, right? So the negative of the image itself, areas that appear light in real life, such as like a white cloth, would appear dark, and darker areas like the shadows or facial features would appear light. And so this was kind of an interesting thing. And when Pia developed the Shroud's negative, he made a stunning discovery, which was that the faint image that was on the Shroud that was visible to the naked eye on the cloth suddenly became a highly detailed and lifelike image of a man. So in essence, what took place here? The Shroud itself is acting like a photographic negative. The darker areas of the Shroud, such as the wounds and facial contours, became bright in the negative, and the lighter areas, such as the background, which became dark. This level of detail, especially in 1898, was far beyond what any medieval artist could have achieved, as the concept of photographic negatives didn't even exist at the time that the Shroud was supposedly created. And if we were to take a look at further studies have demonstrated that the image contains three-dimensional information, meaning that the intensity of the image correlates with the distance from the body to the cloth, meaning that the closer the body was to the cloth, the darker or more intense the image appeared on the fabric. Conversely, as the distance between the body and the cloth increases, the image becomes lighter. This 3D encoding is not found in typical artworks, and it actually suggests a level of complexity that challenges conventional explanations. So this is huge. And despite extensive research, the exact mechanism by which the image was formed remains unexplained by modern science, which again adds to the Shroud's mystery and its intrigue. So here's some takeaways I'd really like for you to consider. Imagine holding a flashlight near a wall. The closer the flashlight is to the wall, the more focused and intense the light looks. As you move the flashlight further away, the light gets dimmer and it spreads out. How does this relate to the Shroud? Scientists studying the Shroud have observed that the image of the body isn't uniform in its intensity. So parts of the image that would have been closer to the cloth, like the nose, cheekbones, the knees, they appear darker. Areas farther from the cloth, like the sides of the body, are lighter. Now, why is this so interesting? It's interesting because this suggests that the image might have been formed by a process sensitive to distance, such as radiation, heat, or some other mechanism that we really don't fully understand. It's almost as if the cloth recorded a 3D map of the body. Now, that's a really interesting thing to take note of with regard to this kind of situation we're taking a look at here, because light also radiates heat. Why is this interesting? Because in verses that describe the angels who were at the tomb are described as having an appearance like lightning, which implies an intense radiant light associated with divine activity around the tomb. And so my question is, could it be that when Jesus was resurrected, his body radiated like this, leading to 3D imprints? Or did the angels, through the power of God, lay hands on the cloth itself, causing it to radiate light and these imprints were made that way. I don't really know for certain, but there's something to that. There's something there. And all I'm saying is that I think there's a biblical precedent to believe that there would have been light involved in this miraculous event of Jesus rising from the dead, particularly because it has such a strong theme in Scripture, this theme of light, the light of the gospel, the light of Christ, the light of the world. And so I just find that very interesting. But the interesting things about this shroud don't stop there. Now, to this point, all I've really done is kind of talked about the history and explained that the shroud has kind of an interesting way with which it has its being, right? It's interesting that it seems to be printed onto the shroud in a 3D way. But there's also scientific evidence that it has a 1st century origin. There's various scientific analysis that have been conducted to determine the age and the origin of this shroud. In fact, in 1988, radiocarbon dating tests dated the shroud to the medieval period, specifically between 1260 and 1390. But there's some subsequent studies that have raised questions about the validity of these particular results, suggesting that the samples tested may have been from a portion of the cloth that was repaired in the Middle Ages, thereby contaminating the results. Remember, the Shroud of Turin has been involved in hundreds of years of conflict, and it's also been in some fires, right? We talked about those nuns who had patched the shroud up. So then the question that comes up, why haven't they tested some of the non-repaired sections? And there's a few reasons, one being that there's some preservation concerns. Carbon dating requires removing and destroying small parts of the cloth, and many are just reluctant to damage the shroud further. Especially if a lot of the people who want to test the shroud only want to try to prove you wrong anyway. And that kind of leads to this next point here, that there's a controversy over prior tests. The disputes about the 1988 results have made researchers very cautious about conducting new tests without clear agreement on methods and procedures. In short, there's some red tape going on. Now, so far, all I've really said is that there was carbon dating that determined that the shroud is as old as the medieval period, and I poked kind of a hole in that carbon dating method because there's a history of it being patched up. So that is something that is important to take note of, because as we go to this next point I want to make, this kind of adds a little bit more legitimacy to the dating of this shroud being in the time of Christ. This is because more recent research has actually employed alternative dating methods. For instance, a study using a technique based on X-ray analysis suggests a much more favorable date to the time of Christ. The technique looks at tiny atomic changes in the linen to figure out its age without damaging it. Because of the finding of this method suggests that the shroud could be about 2,000 years old, matching the time of Jesus, unlike earlier carbon dating that said it was only 700 years old, likely from a repaired section. The findings don't prove necessarily that it's Jesus' burial cloth, but it does make it possible that the shroud is as ancient as believed, and it's really the cumulative case for this cloth that makes it very convincing anyway. For example, additions to the cumulative case are as follows. Forensic studies have identified pollen grains on the shroud that are native to regions in and around Jerusalem, supporting the idea that the cloth originated in the Middle East. There's also the facial features. The image shows a man with a long nose, prominent cheekbones, and a beard, which align with common physical traits of people from the Middle East during the ancient times. Next is the hairstyle and the beard. The long hair and the neatly trimmed beard resembled Jewish customs of the first century, often seen in descriptions or depictions of Jewish men from that era. Next is the physical build. The man appears to be about 5'10" and well built, matching the typical height and physique of Middle Eastern men of that period. Even more interesting than some of those pieces of information is the blood analysis. Studies of the blood stains on the shroud suggest that the person had type AB blood, which is a type more commonly found in populations from the Middle East. The notion that the shroud originated in the Middle East as well as the time of Christ are a huge part of the cumulative case, and these bits of information have really helped out with that. But there's more. Here's more evidence for the cumulative case for the Shroud of Turin. The anatomical and medical accuracy surrounding the research on the Shroud of Turin is just incredible. The Shroud of Turin displays a detailed and anatomically accurate image of a man who appears to have suffered a form of execution consistent with Roman crucifixion tactics. Now, this is huge. The individual depicted shows wounds that correspond to those described in the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion. They are as follows. One being the crown of thorns. There's actually bloodstains on the forehead and the scalp, suggesting puncture wounds consistent with a cap or crown of thorns. There's also evidence of scourging. The back of the figure is covered with marks that align with the use of a Roman flagrum, which is a whip with multiple thongs, each ending with a small piece of metal or bone. Next is that there's crucifixion wounds. The wrists and the feet bear wounds consistent with being pierced by nails, which aligns with Roman crucifixion methods. Notably, this is really important to note, the nail wounds are located at the wrists, which is actually more anatomically accurate, as nails through the palms would not support the weight of the body. And this is something that theologians have pointed out for quite some time, and it's quite interesting that this shroud reveals a man who has these similar wounds through the wrists. But it's not just those wounds, it's a wound in the side that we should take note of. There is a wound on the right side of the chest, which is consistent with a spear thrust, as described in the Gospel of John, where it says this, "But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water." John 19:34. Furthermore, bloodstain analysis has identified the presence of real human blood on the shroud, obviously, considering that we found out the blood type of this person. But some studies have also reported that the blood contains elevated levels of bilirubin, which is a substance produced by the liver in response to severe trauma, like being crucified on a cross. This finding is consistent with the physical torture described in the Gospels. So with all of that information, it can be quite overwhelming, but it kind of lays out this really interesting case surrounding the veracity of the claims made about this burial shroud that we call the Shroud of Turin. This shroud is an ancient artifact that defies naturalistic explanation, as scientific studies have revealed that the image was formed through a process still unknown, with features such as 3D encoding and bloodstains suggesting its authenticity as a burial cloth from the 1st century in the Middle East. And next, even more amazing, is that it has an astonishing, anatomically precise image that perfectly aligns with Roman crucifixion methods and the gospel accounts of Jesus' suffering and death. Now, before I conclude the conclusion, in the Gospels, the angels that are seen at the tomb are described as being bright like lightning. So my question is, could the radiant divine light described in the resurrection accounts explain the event that imprinted this amazing image? Because if so, that offers a tangible connection for us to the moment Jesus conquered death. Really, at the end of all this, that's for you to decide. As for me, all I can do is affirm what the writer of Hebrews says about my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. He says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. I agree. And just as this image appears to have been imprinted onto the cloth due to some sort of radiance of maybe the glory of God, I just have to say, Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God, and he is the exact imprint of his nature, not because of merely the Shroud of Turin, but because he is exactly who he says he is. He is exactly who he claimed to be. And if this is true about the Shroud of Turin, which the evidence is incredible for it, the Gospels are vindicated. All of the attacks against the Gospels and what they claim about the resurrection really don't matter anymore, because the Gospels really are vindicated by this. And on top of that, it proves not just that Jesus died, not just that Jesus was buried, but that he resurrected. And you can find all this just by looking at this interesting topic. And so I find myself very thankful for a French knight in the 14th century, Geoffroy. I really appreciate that he did his thing. And so I'm just excited about this artifact. I hope that you found this interesting. This is an interesting topic, and I really do think it is amazing evidence for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And it really adds to quite a cumulative case for the resurrection. In fact, if you're new to the podcast, I want to encourage you to go and find a podcast between myself and a man by the name of Dr. Donald Williams, who helped me record a podcast that really lays out the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. There's just so much evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. There's so much evidence for it. There's so much documentation surrounding it. It's quite amazing, actually. And so I just wanted to get that out there for those of you who are listening. And you know what? We're coming up on Easter here pretty soon. Boy, does this validate the celebration of Easter. Am I right? I think I am. And so now I want to bring this to a complete close. I want to mention first that next month I'm excited about a podcast that I will be having with Michael Young, aka the Charismatic Cheetah, as well as David Miller, writer of the book Redacted, which I've done a podcast with, and then also Matthew McGuire, who we've had on the podcast a couple times. He was part of a great debate with Daniel McAdams over the subject of ghosts and the paranormal. And then he also came on the podcast for a defense of miracles against David Hume's argument against the existence of miracles. And so those were some great podcasts as well with him. He also has written an amazing book called A Magical World, which is really an incredible look at apologetics from a more charismatic perspective. So I'm really excited to get these guys on the podcast. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about cessationism, or really a response to cessationism. We are obviously all charismatics, and what we want to do is we want to refute some of those claims about the gifts of the Spirit and really have a response to cessationism in general. I just want to say thank you so much to all of you who have listened to this point. I'm really excited about this podcast. I'm really excited about the Shroud of Turin. And I just hope that you guys are just as mind blown about this thing as I am. With that said, God bless you all. I'll see you at the next podcast, and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Bold Apologia podcast. To find out more about Adam Parker's projects, writings, or guest podcast episodes, visit his website at www.boldapologia.com. There you can get more information regarding Adam's works, contact him to be a guest on your show, or leave him a comment for Q&A. Until next time, thank you and God bless.